So, Persona 3 Reload is coming out, and I'm excited. But I have some concerns. Persona 3 Reload feels like it's just gonna be Persona 3 as Persona 5. Persona 3 masquerading as Persona 5. The reason that I primarily feel that way is because of Persona 3 Portable, which was a remake of Persona 3 that came out for the PSP and changed a lot of the mechanics. It added a bunch of great stuff, female MC, it added skill cards, it made fusion less intolerable, but it also changed some things that seem rather unnecessary. The knockdown mechanics work completely differently in Persona 3 versus the way they do in Persona 4, but Persona 3 Portable just sort of changed it to make it all homogeneous. Just to say it, Persona 3 is probably my favorite game ever, so I'm really attached to it the way that it is exactly. For me, I wouldn't have it any other way than the way it came out originally. That doesn't mean I'm not excited for the remake, because I love remakes. I love to see old games with new ideas. I like to see old games be released to a wider audience and become more accessible. I like to see developers try new things with old ideas. But I am so attached to what this game is, this Persona 3 for the PS2. I love everything about it. Well, most things about it. What Nintendo has been doing a lot recently when an old game they made is highly requested by people is making a whole remake and selling it for $60 like it's this big new game. And these remakes are pretty good and it's a great option. But I'm not sure if it's the only way we should be able to play old games. So, let's look at all the things they changed in Persona 3 Portable. Starting with the tired mechanic. In Persona 3, when a party member has been overexerted, they get tired. And once you return to the front of Tartarus, they go home. This is a mechanic that a lot of new players found really annoying, but as you go on it becomes much less of an issue. But it does make the beginning of the game a little bit harder, especially if you're trying to grind and level up. But I think that's part of what they're trying to prevent in the first place. It's expressed pretty heavily in the early story of Persona 3 that using an evoker is not an easy thing. Yukari seems to struggle to pull the trigger many times. I think it's understated how well this translates into the tiredness effect in the gameplay. Your first outings to Tartarus are a strain on your team. They're not used to summoning their personas. This is an example, in my opinion, of gameplay being hindered to immerse you in the situation the characters are in. As you continue and become more powerful and more used to using an evoker, you're able to explore much further with your party. Along with this immersive angle, it helps prevent players from lowering the tension too much in the early game. You're playing the role of an amateur Persona user after all, so while training a bit will be useful, you can only push yourself and your teammates so hard before you all reach your limit. So what Portable did is they left in the tired mechanic, but you can train as much as you want and your teammates won't leave. Now party members will only get the tired status after you leave Tartarus or if they die over and over. To go along with this, teleporting back to the entrance used to fully restore HP and MP. This motivated the player to keep pushing themselves to the next boss floor where they would then be rewarded with permanent progress and a full heal. As long as your party wasn't tired yet, you were free to save and try fighting the floor's boss. Portable completely did away with this game loop. Any floor you reach, you're free to return to from the entrance, but the entrance also no longer heals you. Now you interact with this little clock thing and it'll give you a price, like the fox in Persona 4. The MC in Vanilla and Fess can use any weapon other than guns or knives, but once Portable came out, they were limited to naginata for the female MC and one-handed swords for the male, which used to be the same type of weapon Mitsuru used, but now she has a new type of weapon, rapier. This to me mimics Persona 4 in that each character is limited to their own weapon, which is something that I suppose has been mostly standard through the entire Persona series up to that point, but I must admit I miss the freedom of choice granted by the original game. We also have to talk about the infamous tactics mechanic. Now, this was far from perfect in Persona 3, and I don't think it's exemplified any better than from the final boss, Nick's avatar. Now, what will happen here on the last phase, she'll use this attack, Moonless Gown. What that does is, after casting it, if she gets attacked by anyone for any reason, she'll reflect it and automatically kill the attacker. Now, this would be fine if you had more control over your party. Only she can use this in the middle of a turn before you have any chance to change tactics and stop them from doing this. That can definitely be a source of frustration, and it doesn't exactly feel like a fair punishment. Beyond this is Night Queen once her final phase reaches low HP. What this might end up doing is charming your party members. And if you have a full party, you're guaranteed to have at least one party member with the skill Dia Rahan, which would be a full heal. You can have no control over any of your party members, particularly if your MC gets stricken with any ailment. So let's say you have Fear, and your turn gets skipped, meaning you have no chance to change tactics or use a healing item. It moves on to your Charmed Healer, and they cast Dia Rahan, essentially starting the whole phase over again. And there's nothing you can do to stop this. You can't get your party members to use items to resolve charm. Really, all you can do is put on charm-resistant accessories before the fight even starts. But you'll have to be aware of that threat going into the fight, which I would assume most blind players won't be.
Did you hear me?
He's doing it again! He's doing it again! Oh my god, fuck this! This is insanity! I'm done. This is over. I'm done. I'm not redoing it. I'm done. She's gonna heal him. I'm done. I'm done! It's over! It's over! Goodbye! It's over. That's it for Persona 3, ladies and gentlemen. That's the worst final boss fight I've ever done in an RPG. That's not an exaggeration.
Beyond that, I'd say the game is built pretty well around the idea of being limited to tactics for your supporting party members in combat through a lot of the fights. Someone made a mod for Persona 3 Fest that lets you control your whole party. And what you'll find playing it this way is that the difficulty is incredibly easy. It's because the game wasn't really built with direct party control in mind. I want to emphasize again, this was not implemented perfectly. But I tend to think Portable overcorrected it a little bit, don't you? They just kind of gave up on the whole idea and approached it like any other game. Something that was unique about Persona 3 was the lack of control you had over your party. What if you could, at any point in a fight, stop the combat and edit tactics, kind of like in Persona 2? What if the social links with C's in your party affected a loyalty stat throughout the game, kind of like the Devil Summoner games? With enough trust built, maybe you could reach a point of practical direct control by the end of the game. I don't know, I just kind of like the way that C's is not as united or functional as other JRPG groups. I like the way this was reflected through its design. The investigation team, for instance, is a group of close friends who all have a lot of faith in the MC, while C's is more of a mishmash of Persona users who don't all get along that well at first. Just looking at the visual flair of the game, things like criticals and weakness strikes, you'll see that they changed the entire aesthetic to be more like that of Persona 4. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love the female protagonist. I love the added story events. Either way, we didn't need to just convert Persona 3 mechanically in every way possible into Persona 4. People love Persona 4 for what it is. Persona 3 had its own unique identity that it feels a little stripped of in Persona 3 Portable. To parallel this, Persona 3 Reload has already been confirmed to have all-out attack screens and the shift mechanic resembling Baton Pass. I don't think these are bad mechanics, and I don't even mean to say that they're going to detract from the experience of Reload, but they make me think more about Persona 5 than they do Persona 3. The same way Mega Evolutions, Fairy Types, Poke-Ami make me think more of Pokemon X and Y than Ruby and Sapphire. They don't necessarily ruin the vision of the original, but rather they divert it into a completely new experience, which remakes will often do inevitably. It's not a bad thing. When I think about good remakes, I think about something like Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia. It's a remake of the NES game Fire Emblem Gaiden, and it improves so much about the original. It adds beautiful artwork, amazing voice acting, new characters that fit the narrative, and even enhance it in some ways. Amazing remixes of all the music with multiple versions to fit different parts of the game. It's just an amazing remake. But I'm not sure that I would think it means the original should cease to exist. Fire Emblem Awakening was a revolution for the Fire Emblem series, particularly from a Western perspective, for better and for worse. That could be attributed to many things, one of which might be a more lighthearted tone. Something this new tone lent itself well to was to have characters shout these cutting, witty, cute, or funny lines right before landing a critical.
Pick a god and pray. It's been lovely.
I didn't want to do this!
Come on, look at me!
This was then carried over to the world and characters of Fire Emblem Gaiden with Shadows of Valentia. I can see why someone might not enjoy this more light-hearted feature being retrofitted to this more grounded story. It doesn't really bother me, but it's something that makes it different, kind of sets a different tone. Demon's Souls is beautiful. I mean, look at that. Oh, and when you look at it versus the original, it's just so beautiful. One of the best looking games I've ever seen. But sometimes the music feels a little strange. I mean, listen to the Dirty Colossus theme in the original Demon's Souls. And then the version they made for the remake just kind of misses the mark to me. This theme is so bombastic for this pile of poopy boss that trudges slowly around the arena, pathetically waving its oversized arm around. I think it goes without saying that this music resembles more something that you would hear during a fast-paced boss fight in Bloodborne. I mean, did you catch the sanguine? Bloodborne in general is a more thrilling game, but that's often not the kind of game Demon's Souls is at all. I don't think Demon's Souls will shine brightest wearing a different game's hand-me-downs. Wind Waker HD, also beautiful. Added selfies, isn't that fun? Amazing Miiverse integration.
What the fuck? Oh baby, you light me up.
It's too bad it's gone. I'm so sad. And a streamlining of the Triforce quest, which gave a lot of people trouble. I should say, when I use the term remake, I mean it kind of loosely because there are these things called remasters, which isn't exactly a port, but not exactly a remake either. It will use most of the same assets, but also try to clean them up and modernize them. In the same vein as remakes, I'm not sure a remaster is ever a perfect replacement for an original release. To that end, I'd like to point out that once Persona 3 Reload comes out, we will have Persona 3, Persona 3 FES, Persona 3 Portable, the 2023 remaster of Persona 3 Portable, which did actually make some questionable and considerable changes, and Persona 3 Reload. 5 iterations of Persona 3. All of that, and yet the original vanilla release of Persona 3 has gotten no re-release of any kind whatsoever. Even FES got re-released digitally on the PS3 and has gotten several reprints. A lot of people really didn't like the Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne HD remaster. The music continues to be compressed as it was in the original release, which makes it sound a lot different than the HD releases that came with the CD soundtrack. For me personally, I think I prefer it the way it always was. I mean, this... doesn't really sound the same as this. In fact, it's very clearly not the same at all. Far beyond audio quality, the composition is different. I wouldn't want to see the in-game compositions that complement the game so well as it is get replaced with and overshadowed by the redone soundtrack. While it's great for listening, it doesn't always evoke the same atmosphere. I understand when people say they want the higher quality soundtrack in the game, but I think I'd prefer an option over a pure replacement, kind of like in Xenoblade. Maybe cleaning up the originals as they were? Something that doesn't get talked about much is how the battle themes in Nocturne are quite dynamic. The same battle theme won't always go the same way in each battle. I imagine it would be quite an undertaking to clean all of this up and make it work the same way. Sometimes a remake leaves me with something to be desired. So let's look at some remakes like that. Battle for Bikini Bottom. That is a game that means very much to me and my heart. I love SpongeBob, and I love this SpongeBob video game. And I think a lot of people do. Look at this tweet. Did better than Pokemon. SpongeBob. 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 People attribute this game these days to speedrunning, and this game has found a really passionate and dedicated speedrunning community for sure. But I think the root of this game's popularity goes more back to when it first came out. I can only speak on this anecdotally, but almost everyone my age I know who had a game system around the early 2000s and liked SpongeBob has played this game, and that was a lot of people. Nickelodeon went hard promoting it during commercial breaks, and it worked. Not just for that reason, but also because it's a genuinely fun game. It's a well-made 3D platform collectathon, clearly made with so much love for the show. I can't believe how many people cut this remake slack. It feels worse than the original in so many ways to me. Just some little things that irk me. When you teleport to Mr. Krabs it'll always take you to where he was standing at the beginning of the game. So if you're at the end of the game, trying to get these last few golden spatulas from Mr. Krabs, if you choose to warp to him, they're going to take you all the way to SpongeBob's house, and you need to spongeball your way all the way to the Krusty Krab. In the original, in the Mermalair level, you go up to the invisible boatmobile and you're walking around in this invisible thing and you're like, huh? It glitched. But then you push the button below to reveal what it is you were standing on. And you go, oh, haha. In Rehydrated, it's not only the invisible boatmobile, but also the intangible boatmobile. There's nothing there until you make it appear. And then you go to stand in it, and as soon as it's gone, you fall. All they really went out of their way to update was the visuals and some shiny object costs. The multiplayer mode is just awful. It's completely unfinished, and it might as well have been scrapped like it was in the original release. It's not worth playing at all, and not worth the remake. But in the end, even if this remake was perfect in my head and had everything I could have wanted it to have, and added 30 new levels that felt like they were something out of the original and added so much more magic, I don't think I would ever say that it should replace the original entirely. But that seems to be what it's done. The majority of people playing Battle for Bikini Bottom these days are going to be playing this remake. And it makes sense, it's the most accessible version of it. It just makes me sad that there's no easy legal way to access the original version. I still think it's buggier than the original was. And it's the only version of the game that's available outside of North America and Europe. Pokemon Diamond and Pearl are fantastic games to me, but they do have some glaring flaws, like being really slow. That was why when Pokemon Platinum came out 3 years later, it was such a big improvement. They made all the Pokemon that got new evolutions in that generation native to the Sinnoh region. They added more post-game content like gym leader rematches, and most important, now when you surf, you're not gonna be surfing on a Slowpoke. And then fast forward 12 years, and we get the remakes of Diamond and Pearl, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. These remakes were different than what had come before. The standard set by previous Pokemon remakes is to add some new Pokemon from later generations, to add some new mechanics to fit the newer hardware, maybe some mechanics introduced in the previous game of that generation. These games don't really do any of that, and simply aim to remake Diamond and Pearl exactly as they were. But they didn't completely succeed in doing that. The Global Trade Station was introduced with Pokemon Diamond and Pearl on the DS and with Nintendo Wi-Fi connection. Instead of having it return, they added the Global Wonder Station. This replaces the GTS with Wonder Trade. The only reason I can surmise that they might have chosen to do this is so that you're not disincentivized from downloading and using Pokemon Home for the GTS. I guess it could be worse, and it's not like they're gouging you for money. The GTS in Home is a free service. But I do think it's on the questionable side to omit it just for that reason. It was such a cool thing when Diamond and Pearl were new, and the game made such a big deal out of it originally. There were all these NPCs talking about using it and how much they liked it. How much harm would it have really done on Pokemon Home subscriptions just to have the GTS available in this game? Pretty much nothing from Platinum made it in except this NPC, and starters in Amity Square. I get it's a remake of Diamond and Pearl and not Platinum, But the omissions really do stick out when the games have hardly anything new at all to be found. Heart Gold and Soul Silver seemed to have no problem including much of the content that was added to the Johto region through Crystal, so it's not like there's no precedent at all. Granted, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire omitted much of the content added in Emerald, but it also added so many new ideas on its own that I find it much easier to forgive these games. It even added a whole new episode in the post-game for Rayquaza to get some time in the spotlight. And it made Deoxys, a historically event-exclusive Pokemon, catchable in-game without events for the first time ever. Contrastly, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl don't do much at all for Giratina. It's just sitting there in Turnback Cave, and you can do a little battle in Ramana's Park for the Grisius Orb. I guess at least to the game's credit, it sort of gave the Deoxys treatment to Arceus if you decide to buy and finish a whole other game. Not only them, but Mew and Jirachi are actually free gifts pretty early in the game if you have Sword or Shield and Let's Go. Those are also unprecedented, mythical, event-exclusive Pokemon just kind of being given out by the game. I guess it is something. Though I do wish this is something limited to the post-game. It feels a little too easy to just walk up and get them so early. The game is still built like there's a grid, but there's no actual grid. You just have free reign to run in any direction you want, and it leads to some awkward maneuvering. The unpatched version of this game literally just used the raw MIDI tracks. It was definitely a mistake, but this is what it sounded like before a Day 1 patch was released. Overall, I played these games and I still had a blast. These are all problems I had, but I love Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, and it felt like Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, but I can't help but yearn for the original playing these. I would take it's just I would take Slowpoke surfing. So, needless for me to say, I think I appreciate Diamond and Pearl more as they were originally. I would never want this to be considered the definitive release of the Sinnoh games. I still love these games, and I'm glad they were able to at least make a bunch of Pokemon catchable from the early game with the Grand Underground. But these are so far from perfect. Just as Diamond and Pearl were. Either way, I'd rather have my Slowpoke surfing. Persona 1 got its own little remaster, which redid the entire soundtrack. I'm going to say for myself, I love all of these new tracks. I love them as music, and it really does have that fun, newer Persona sound. But it does not scream Megami Ibunroku Persona in the slightest. The new soundtrack also actually has fewer tracks than the original did. The majority of the main cast's unique themes have been cut, only to be replaced with much of the same repetitive songs. To make things even more complicated, back when Persona 1 first released in the West as Revelations Persona, it completely removed the Snow Queen quest, a secret second campaign for the game. If you're a non-Japanese Persona fan who'd like to play the original Persona, and you're not interested in modding your game or playing unofficial releases, you're stuck picking between this 90s 4Kids hyper-localized release with essentially half the content, or a remaster that uprooted the entire original soundtrack for one that not only evokes a completely different atmosphere, but also repeats itself more. Again, I like remakes. My argument isn't that remakes are bad. I think they're great. They can bring something to the experience that the original never could. But their purpose should never be to remove access to the original versions of these games. Which is exactly what happened when the Grand Theft Auto trilogy came out. When Dark Souls Remastered came out. At the 2016 Game Developers Conference, game archivist, journalist, and developer Frank Cifaldi gave a presentation on the development of Mega Man Legacy Collection. And he talks about how important it was to him to preserve the game exactly the way it was in this re-release. There was an interesting point made about looking at the code of the Virtual Console releases of Super Mario Bros. That made it seem as if Nintendo stole their own game off the internet and sold it back to you.
I would posit that Nintendo downloaded Super Mario Bros. From the internet and sold it back to you.
This was later proven untrue, but I think the point is still valid that Nintendo and other game companies don't seem very interested in selling their games exactly as they were. Remakes are great, but I don't think they should be thought of as proper preservation. Game preservation, that's a bit of a buzzword these days, isn't it? Well, let me try to define it for the purposes of this video. What preservation is to me is the kind that's being advocated for throughout this presentation. Making sure as many games as possible, from the all-time classics to the ludicrously obscure, have a means of being played and experienced just as they were upon release by anyone. It might seem trivial, but just think about the little things in your favorite game. Like, how about the original sound Steve made in Minecraft? This was changed years ago, but this voice clip is still being circulated to this day. Minecraft would not have been the same game if this little voice clip was never a part of it. I don't mean to say it would be better or worse, but think about the butterfly effect it would have if this sound never existed. All of the offhand references we wouldn't be making to it. These little things do matter. At the end of a review for Wind Waker HD by YouTuber Matthew Mitosis, he said something that always struck me.
Is this the definitive version of the Wind Waker? My answer would have to be no, but not because it's not necessarily better than the original. In plenty of ways it is. Rather, I think a definitive version of the Wind Waker no longer exists, which is kind of a shame in and of itself. I couldn't help but shake the feeling that this new iteration of the Wind Waker seeks to overwrite the old one rather than preserve it. As much as I enjoyed it, I hope it doesn't succeed in that goal. The new version of the Wind Waker is well worth playing, but so is the original. I can only hope history has enough room for 2 Wind Wakers.
I can only hope that history has enough room for 2 Wind Wakers. I think there's a lot of truth to that when a good remake comes out. It always gets something so right that improves the original vision so much, but at the same time there's always something lost as well. In fact, you this statement to most good remakes, and it fits pretty well. I love a good remake, but I think it's just as important, if not more, to make sure the original doesn't die after it's released. How many people have played Chow Adventure on the VMU, or seen the Chow Gardens in Sonic Adventure 2 in their full glory? Maybe the differences can come down to small petty details, but when we truly love something, we love it down to those minuscule, unimportant things, every little bit of it. A game that doesn't replicate every single thing like that is just not going to be the same game. And that's fine. In fact, when they're trying to be the same game, that's when they seem to be received the worst. Remasters can be a good way to adapt older games to newer hardware, but they always seem to get the biggest backlash. Nocturne, Dark Souls, GTA, I mean, they really do deserve criticism, but it goes to show how the subtlest of changes can mean a lot to people. I don't see anything wrong with these, but it does become a problem when they're enforced as the only accessible option to play. The point Cifaldi wanted to make in this talk was the importance of emulation. And when I look at things this way, I can't help but agree with him. It seems to be the only possible way to keep the original releases of games alive. I don't want to say that we need to rely on piracy, but looking realistically at how older games have been treated by the companies that released them, I think it speaks for itself. I hope we can live in a world where old games don't only get sold for double or more their original sold price on 20-year-old discs or cartridges secondhand, or as a part of a Netflix-like subscription where you can only play from a limited selection that gets drip-fed over years of annual renewal. I hope that games can be sold to profit the actual designers and developers who dedicated their time to making these games, and not just the companies who employed them and published them. I hope they can be sold in a way that's sustainable and meaningful, giving you a product that's versatile, maybe something that you can load into an emulator on your PC, instead of it falling into obscurity stuck on an old plastic box that nobody wants to use anymore. I love the way remakes revitalize old games and make them feel new again. For many reasons, they seem more profitable than a simple re-release. Veterans who have already played and experienced a game in full aren't likely to purchase a straight port or an emulated re-release if it has nothing new to offer them. They definitely garner more hype. Remaking a game could be seen as a short-sighted endeavor. They don't often satisfy every fan of their original releases, and even less often actually eclipse the game they're made after, but I still love them, and I feel excited when a remake for a game I love is on its way. It's so cool to see people feeling so hyped about Persona 3 again. When I heard the new Moons Reaching Out Stars, it made me...
I never felt like so different now. It doesn't seem like we've been...
That is the real beauty of a remake. Experimenting by building new ideas with the ones originally presented, making beautiful new artwork and music, and immersing new players into the fascinating world that captivated everyone all those years back in a more modern way. You can't stop the flow of time. It delivers us all to the same end, doesn't it? And with time, every new game will one day be an old game. I hope history has enough room for 5 Persona 3s.